Assalamu alaikum and welcome to a Brain podcast. Today, with myself, Jyoti and Shofik, we have with us Thomas Kean. Thomas is dialing in from Melbourne, Australia. He is affiliated with International Crisis Group and he knows Bangladesh very well, having covered the momentous events of the last 12 to 18 months. But today we're talking to him not about Bangladesh as such, but about Myanmar, because he knows Myanmar just as well, if not better. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm not sure I'd describe myself as a Bangladesh expert. I think I'll leave the politics to experts like you. But yeah, it's a pleasure, to join and to have the chance to talk about developments in Myanmar and Rakhine State.
Cool. Why don't we start at the beginning, or at a high level? Like, what is going on in Myanmar? We know that there was the military coup in 2021, and we know that it's a country, with multiple fissures and civil strifes and so on. But paint us a picture.
That's right. Yeah. You can take a starting point of 2021, the military coup. But if we go back a little bit further, Myanmar, since independence, has always had insurgency, armed conflict, attempts to overthrow the state. And in the middle, you've had the military, which in its belief is holding the country together against these insurgent forces. So prior to the coup, there was around 20 what we call ethnic armed groups or ethnic armed organizations. Some had ceasefires with the central state. Others did not and had very inactive conflict. Um, but the coup really changed things in a significant way in the sense that it mobilized the Burman majority um, against the military in armed struggle. And we hadn't seen this really since the end of the communist insurgency in lowland Myanmar in the 1970s. After 50 years of essentially peace prevailing in lowland areas, the river valleys where the majority of the population live that are dominated by the Bamar or Burman people, um, the coup reignited a Burman insurgency against the Myanmar military and the Myanmar state. Um, and there's been a level of cooperation between these new insurgent groups, some of which call themselves PDFs and are aligned with the National Unity Government, the parallel government, but others that run almost independently or autonomously. There's been a lot of cooperation between them and the existing ethnic armed groups. Um, and the military has essentially found itself fighting on a huge number of fronts. We've got Rakhine in the west, obviously. You've got the Kachin in the north. In the northeast, you've got half a dozen armed groups, ethnic armed groups, and then southeast as well, which where the trend had been towards ceasefires has gone the other way, and you've got um, ethnic armed groups once again fighting the military. So, if you look at the Myanmar state, you've got in the center, Yangon and Naypyidaw, Mandalay, the lowland areas. These are now essentially surrounded by insurgent groups, whether they're ethnic armed groups or the newer forces. And the military has really, struggled just because of the sheer number of fronts that it's fighting on and the refusal of people to cow, I suppose, to its tactics, its brutal tactics, right? The regular human rights violations, war crimes that it carries out, have not, convinced people to give up struggle or supporting the revolutionary movement. They've actually created more anger at the regime and fueled the insurgency against it. So, you know, until say late 2023, it seemed like things were kind of a little bit locked in a stalemate. I mean, the military wasn't able to eradicate the armed groups it was fighting against. But it also, the armed groups didn't seem like they could get the upper hand against the military. But then Operation 1027 was launched. So this is three of the most powerful ethnic armed groups carrying out surprise attacks in firstly in Shan State on the Chinese border, and then shortly afterwards in Rakhine. And that was a bit of a game changer. Them cooperating with some resistance groups and carrying out these attacks, and the way that the military defenses really crumbled under that onslaught is unlike anything that we've really seen in Myanmar, probably since the late 40s or early 50s. Um, and so, yeah, a really pivotal moment. And that prompted China to intervene more strongly, more decisively in Myanmar. Um, I know in Bangladesh, when I talk to people, it often, the what I hear is often that, well, China is essentially pulling the strings in Myanmar, and is either it's propping up the regime and it's its closest ally and this kind of thing. Well, after the coup, that wasn't really the case. I mean, China tried to take a kind of hands-off approach. I mean, it has long had a difficult relationship with Min Aung Hlaing, um, and didn't support the coup. But what happened after 1027 was that China started to worry that the military was going to collapse, or there was a risk that it would collapse. And so last year we saw China kind of swing a bit more strongly behind the regime to shore it up, to prevent it from collapsing. Um, and so I suppose that's where we kind of find ourselves now, is that in the center of Myanmar, you've got the military in control, but very weak. And then you've got ethnic armed groups and other insurgent forces controlling most of the periphery of the country, most of the country's international borders, and even a lot of the major highways in border areas. Key infrastructure is now under the control of non-state armed groups. So the military is in its weakest position really since independence in Myanmar, and dependent on, to some extent, on China's support to prevent it from being overwhelmed.
Okay. All right. So that's a very comprehensive overview, but that also then leads to, I have a bunch of questions, but Shafiq, chime in as well. Um, did you want
Yeah,
to go
Thomas,
first?
thank you very much. That was a very good primer of the what's going on. Like I personally I know that a lot of things have been going on in Myanmar, but I deliberately often try to overlook it because it's so complex. Because Myanmar is a country like almost no other in this Asian region. It's almost like it's a African ethnic societies conglomerate, something held together in Asia, and it is a nightmare to follow different factions and everything. And if you look at the current map, it's even more nightmarish because it seems like it could be like a total state failure, like Syria or something, like collapse, and we haven't seen that ever part of the world since Second World War. So, but my basic question is that what are these groups seeking? Are they seeking federalism or outright independence? Because there's a difference. Are they looking to accommodate their own ethnic groups in a federal structure? And that's my first question. What's their aim? And why the central military junta has not been to a to more federal structure since the early, because it plainly cannot control the whole country. It failed for 80, 90, nearly 100 years. So that's my two
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe I'll take the second one first. Why has the military not given up more power? Um, I mean, as I said earlier, like the military sees itself as holding the country together in the face of ethnic insurgency primarily. And so it's always been reluctant to devolve any power from the center. And the concessions that, particularly more recently, it has been willing to make just have gone, not gone anywhere near far enough to address the aspirations of ethnic armed groups, and I think ethnic people more broadly in Myanmar. So there's a huge gap between um, what most ethnic armed groups and their supporters are demanding and fighting for, and what the military is willing to give. And this has come through multiple times. In there were a lot of ceasefires in the late 80s and early 90s between the military regime and ethnic armed groups at that time. And that was they were supposed to lead to a political settlement. Um, but the military controlled that process of drafting what became the 2008 Constitution, and the demands that ethnic minorities put forward in that process were essentially ignored by the military. And so what we ended up with was 2008 Constitution, which contains some decentralization of power, some sort of acknowledgement of the need to give more, authority to local governments, but in a very highly constricted way. I mean, just to give you one example, the president appoints the chief ministers of each state and region. Um, and so even if the ethnic minority party gets a majority in a state, and this happened in Rakhine, the Rakhine party did very well in multiple elections, but was never able to appoint the chief minister. It was still controlled by Naypyidaw. And this wasn't just the military, it was the military that drafted that constitution, but the NLD that won the 2015 election, Daw Aung San Suu Kyi's party, I mean, they refused to let the Rakhine party choose their chief minister. They still insisted on appointing the chief minister, right? And so it's not, while it is now, the military refusing to grant this greater decentralization or devolution of power, it's been the Burma or Burman politicians more broadly, including the NLD, that until now have been unwilling to do it, not only the military. And among ethnic minorities is often referred to as Burma chauvinism, this kind of sense that, yeah, nominally we're all equal, but in reality it's the Burmans who are, who should control everything. And this is the kind of natural state of affairs, and the kind of ethnic minorities in the upland areas just need to accept the reality. So that has kind of been the motor or the engine of insurgency in Myanmar for decades. Um, yeah. So, sorry, can you remind me of your first question?
Like
I'll
what?
take Shafiq's first. Yeah, no, go on, Shafiq. Because I have
Yeah.
a follow-up with that. So you go. Yeah.
So what about the current aims of the groups? Like, are they seeking
Yeah.
outright independence, or are they still willing to accommodate within or like an expensive federal structure?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good question. And
And
nice.
just a
Yeah.
supplementary question with that, related
Okay.
to Shafiq, is the ethnic insurgencies or ethnic armed groups, do they have cross-border support? And maybe some of them do, maybe some of them don't. So yeah, sort of what kind of cross-border support there might be. So those are the related questions, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. So in terms of the aspirations for ethnic armed groups, I mean, if we go back a long way, like post-independence period, quite a few of them did aspire to have independent states, um, and to break away, to secede from Myanmar or Burma as it was then. But over the decades, most of them have moved away from this goal, both privately and publicly. I mean, I think they recognize that, in the they were making these demands or had these aspirations. It was post World War II, decolonialization.
Sure.
There were a lot of new states being created at that time. So this wasn't sort of out of step with what was happening around the world. But over the decades, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, I mean, that became less of a trend. And I think now they recognize that the geopolitical environment does not favor the creation of new states. And so, whether it's China or Thailand or India or Bangladesh, that, without the support of one of those countries, it's going to be very difficult for, an independent state to survive, if they did manage to break away from Myanmar. And so
Especially in uplands, right? They're landlocked. So, for example, Shan or Karen, sort of, they wouldn't have access to the sea, right? Even if they did
no, they wouldn't have
militarily
access to,
capture a
yeah,
whole
that's
bunch of
right.
land. Yeah.
Yeah, they wouldn't have access to the sea, and transport is often quite difficult in these regions. Even without, I mean, we're talking about very mountainous areas often. Um, and so really the relationship with neighboring states becomes crucial, right? And when we look around the borders of Myanmar, there are ethnic armed groups that have managed to integrate closely with neighboring states. I think the United Wa State Army being kind of the key example here. I mean, they're in Shan State, on the border with China, and they have created a quasi state that is essentially integrated into, the Chinese economy, the Chinese state. They use Chinese telecommunications, the banking system, electricity, trade is all with China, and the people that live in that region, I mean, they don't look towards Naypyidaw. They look towards Beijing, or probably more like Yunnan province, right? Um, but they're not independent, and they're not, saying that they want to become independent. What they have is a high degree of autonomy. I mean, they're nearly completely autonomous. And they've built up their army to the point that the Myanmar military could never really dream of recapturing that territory from them. The cost would just be too high. In other areas, you've got states, quasi-states along borders that are just not as integrated. It really depends on, um, you know, uh, the policies of neighboring countries, how comfortable the ethnic armed group is with that neighboring country. So even along the border with China, there's a lot of diversity, right? I mean, the Kachin, KIA have had a more difficult relationship with China over the years. And so there isn't the same level of integration with the Chinese economy and Chinese state, because it's something that the KIA themselves are not comfortable with. They would see it as a security risk to be too integrated and too dependent on China. Um, a lot of it comes down to culture as well, right? How similar the cultures are and how comfortable they feel dealing with each other. So what we get, is kind of two things, I think. One is, what is the stated aspiration politically? And it's on a spectrum. Um, you know, of probably, if we have independence at one end, which not many groups, if any, are really aspiring to these days. On the other end is more like a federal system within a Myanmar state that has a central authority and power is devolved or decentralized um, to a reasonably high degree. And between those two, then you have maybe someone like a group like the Arakan Army that isn't so interested in federalism. They talk about a Confederate state, and they do look towards the United Wa State Army as an example of, I think what they want, which is a high degree of autonomy, very little um, authority vested in the central state. Um, but it is on a spectrum, and where you place on that spectrum depends on, geography, on culture, political ideology. But yeah, in this day and age, there's very, not many groups, if any, are talking about independence anymore. It's just, I think, unrealistic.
A follow-up question then would be that what are the political, what are the political ideologies of various groups, particularly Arakan Army, but others as well? And related to that, you also mentioned that even the NLD, the democratically elected government, they also subscribe to the majoritarian sort of
Yeah.
inclination, right? So now that they sort of the national unity government is also fighting an insurgency, right? So um, sort of what's the politics there? That like sort of do they if the coup were to be reversed, if the army were to be defeated, do they all believe in that like sort of some sort of elections and then power sharing, or that's not really on the cards, and basically whoever controls what decides what they would do?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, I mean the NLD did adopt this kind of majoritarian policy in the national parliament from 2015 to 2020. For example, they put forward constitutional amendments that the military vetoed. The way constitutional change was structured in the constitution essentially gave the military a veto because you needed more than 75% support for an amendment for it to pass. But the military had 25% of seats allocated, so an effective veto. The proposals that the NLD put forward were really about addressing, reducing the military's influence in politics, and making the country more democratic. But there was very little put forward related to addressing the aspirations of ethnic minorities. Now, it's a fair while ago now. So from what I can recall, the NLD defended this by saying, well, this is the first step. We need to reduce the military's power and make the constitution more democratic before we move into decentralization of power. If we decentralize power without weakening the military's influence, then it will allow the military to, if it can't get control at the national level, it will allow the military or create openings for the military at the local level to control things. Which I don't think was ever, like a particularly strong argument. But fast forward to the coup, to what extent did it change the relationship between the Burma and ethnic minorities? I think there has been some change, but it's probably not been as much as was hoped initially after the coup. So after the coup, some new structures were set up. The National Unity Government, that you mentioned, is one of these. National Unity Government contained, it had much higher ethnic minority representation than there had been under the NLD government or the military-backed government before that. And so that was seen as a positive. And then you also had the NUCC, National Unity Consultative Council, which was supposed to, be a consultative body that would come up with a new constitution, for example. And a draft constitution was released fairly quickly. So there was some positive movement here, signs that the majority Burman population, as represented, in this phase by NLD politicians primarily, who had fled from central Myanmar after the coup, were interested in making concessions to minorities to, move towards some kind of settlement. And this was really out of necessity. I mean, the NUG, would have struggled to survive without the support of ethnic armed groups. I mean, for example, they need to base themselves somewhere in the country, right? And a lot of the NUG members base themselves in the liberated areas of ethnic armed groups. And also they wanted to create their own army, PDFs. So they needed some way to get weapons, to get training and so on. So they needed the ethnic armed groups for that as well. So it was a concession based out of necessity. What's happened over time is that process has really become stuck. It hasn't moved forward much at all. And those old tensions and suspicions between the majority Burmans and ethnic minorities have once again come to the fore. A lot of this doesn't play out in public, but generally, ethnic politicians and armed groups that are involved in these structures, what they see is that the NLD, the Burman NLD members who are taking part are really trying to control the process, and are fundamentally just unwilling to give up power or to share power with minorities in these new structures. And from their point of view, that's why this process has become stuck. So while there has been a little bit of progress, I think it hasn't gone anywhere near as far as was hoped after after the coup. And that kind of ties into your point, like what would happen if the military was defeated or collapsed? And I think because there isn't a overarching kind of political agreement between the NUG or other Burman forces and ethnic armed groups and other ethnic minorities, um, you know, it what we would get, I think, is a collection of states. The Wa controlling their area, the Ta'ang TNLA controlling their area, Arakan Army controlling their area, rather than some sort of integrated system, integrated politically, integrated economically. There would be a high degree of fragmentation.
Right. So, sort of we could end up with something like Somalia, where there is a nominally one Somalia
Mm,
state, but in reality there are like, sort of three quasi-independent or de facto independent countries, that do their own things, without formally being a
yeah,
independent sort of sovereign state, but de
yeah.
facto, Somaliland and Puntland having their, so something like that you could have the Shan in the north with integrated to China, but then you could probably have Arakan Army controlling their territory. Is that roughly, I mean, that's what
Yeah,
a relative peace might look like
yeah.
if the war were to end.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there would be more integration than that out of necessity because w we would get a reasonably large number of small territories that, as you correctly pointed out, some of them would be quite landlocked. Maybe they would have no access to an international border, let alone, the ocean,
Right.
or maybe just limited access. And so they would need necessarily to work together, I think. And that would be positive in the sense that, you know, I, I suppose one of the narratives that the military has put forward um, is that without the military, you would get balkanization. And there's implicit, I suppose, warning that it would be violent, that, the state could collapse and you would get all these armed groups start to fight each other. And certainly there's a risk of armed groups fighting each other. This does happen. They, often over resources. Um, but I mean, I don't think we should assume that would happen. I mean, I think they would need to cooperate and coordinate quite a bit just to make their territories viable. And there is quite a reasonable level of coordination between them already. I mean, they have worked together militarily and politically over the years, over the decades. And so, yeah, I just a caution I would, that I would put out there is that we shouldn't assume that it would be a violent process.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So that leads to I have questions now that could go in two different directions. So why don't I, sort of put them to you, and then you can answer whichever order, right? So one is if we think about whole of Myanmar. So sort of um, how is it doing economically? So Myanmar had been 60, 70 years ago, or at independence, one of the more affluent of Southeast Asian countries. And we know that for sort of long period of self-imposed isolation, it fell behind pretty much everyone else in the neighborhood. Um, and then it started making progress in the 2010s during the sort of during the quasi-democratic era. But where
yeah,
where are they now? You talked about resources, so sort of the ethnic groups and the territories that they control. Sort of
yeah.
sort of so that's one kind of thing that how is it doing economically? how close to that resource crunch the military is facing. That's one direction. A different set of questions is more about Rakhine, which is obviously sort of next to Bangladesh, and where obviously there is for our listeners particular interest. So yes, do you want to cover sort of the Rakhine and then go back to the broader, or the other way around?
Maybe we'll start with your question on the economy, I think, the national economy. I mean, to put it bluntly, the coup has been an absolute disaster for Myanmar overall, but economically as well. Um, the economy had done really well, for around a decade since the military initiated reforms in 2011. Um, there was there were political reforms, but there were also very important economic reforms. They really liberalized the economy and attracted a lot of foreign investment. The garment sector, for example, was competing with Bangladesh. Certainly not as big, but was growing at a very rapid pace prior to COVID. Um, but yeah, I mean, the estimates of what the counterfactual, like how big would the Myanmar economy have been today if the coup didn't happen? It's quite staggering. I mean, we're talking sort of 30-40% perhaps bigger. It's essentially not grown since since the coup. We're talking a period of almost 4.5 years of no growth, negative growth, really. Um, and now, more recently, the earthquake as well, which I'm sure many of your listeners have heard about, this massive earthquake that hit in late March, and devastated, the kind of economic heartland, really, of central Myanmar, the city of Mandalay, right down the Sagaing Fault to Naypyidaw, the capital. Um, and this is done, well, the estimates from the World Bank, a direct damage bill of around 10, $11 billion. And there's no resources really to rebuild. No state resources, obviously not going to be international funding coming in to help with the rebuilding. And people themselves, in this economic situation don't have the resources to rebuild. So that's been a disaster. But the thing is that the Myanmar military has this incredible capacity to extract what it needs to survive from the Myanmar economy. No matter how bad things are, it does find a way to survive. It has shown that through the decades. I mean, as you said, at independence, Myanmar, then Burma, was considered sort of one of the wealthier countries in Southeast Asia. But the 1962 coup and the imposition of a socialist economy, absolutely devastated the country and turned it into the poorest country in Southeast Asia. Yet the military was able to maintain its grip. And so the military has the capacity to do this. Although what I would say is that in the past it has done this through dependence on natural resources in part. Some of those natural resources are now declining. So I'm thinking of offshore gas, for example. The gas fields that were developed in the 90s and 2000s have already peaked and are declining fairly rapidly. And there's been no new investment in exploration or development for quite a long time, certainly not since the coup. So that source of income is just, dropping off a cliff. But also the loss of territorial control. The upland areas, the mountain areas are where a lot of the country's natural resources are, particularly mineral resources. And we're talking jade and gems, but also rare earths, for example. And so the military has also lost control of these resources that in the past have been important for sustaining it. So it's, it's not a pretty picture for the regime, but I think, they have shown this capacity, as I said, to extract what they need to survive from the economy.
Yeah. So I'm reminded of an Anthony Bourdain episode from about 10, 12 years ago when Myanmar just started opening up, and so there were all these talks of hope and rebirth, and so sort of it's tragic to see that that hasn't happened, or like sort of 30-40% gap is a huge gap, right? So um
Yeah. I
yeah.
was just thinking about this morning, actually, because I was listening to a podcast about Vietnam and its sort of economic aspirations and, that difficulty in reaching a sort of upper middle income, becoming an upper middle income country, right? And I mean, Myanmar, it felt like it was on track in a lot of ways. I mean, it had a lot of political problems and conflict related problems. I mean, we can talk about the Rohingya as well, right? But I mean, economically, the country was doing pretty well and a lot of people were coming out of poverty. It was taking advantage of a sort of demographic dividend. And now, I mean, it may have just missed its chance to develop, right? And to reach, even a sort of middle income country status. Yeah, I just think it's going to be really difficult. Will there be a second chance for Myanmar? It's not really clear. And I think that's really the tragedy of the coup in a lot of ways, is that opportunity that's been missed.
Yeah. Would get into Rakhine and Rohingyas, obviously, but I think sort of we may go a
Mm.
bit longer than our usual 1 hour mark, because this is very important and fascinating stuff. If that's okay with you, Tom. Yeah.
That's fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
apologies if some of my responses are
No,
long-winded.
no. This is very. I think our reader, our audience would find this very important and very useful. Um, so the next question before going into Rakhine and the Rohingyas, you mentioned that sort of the China has stepped in or shored up the regime because they fear a state collapse, wholesale state collapse, sudden collapse of authority. Um, where does the US and other Southeast Asian neighbors and US's Quad partners, so sort of India and Australia and Japan, so where do the regional, the neighbors and regional powers, global powers, where do they all fit in this, this kaleidoscope?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to a large extent, I think Western countries have outsourced the problem to ASEAN, and tried to get ASEAN to take the lead. Hasn't been a lot of willingness in Western capitals to take up the Myanmar issue, right? I mean, I think for a lot of governments, they look at it and go, "Whoa, this is pretty tough, right? How we can't see an easy solution here." So, why would they sort of take the lead? It's easy for them. The path of least resistance is to say, "Okay, ASEAN, step up to the plate, and we'll support you on this one." And so I think that's really been the policy since the coup. And what Western governments have done is try to alleviate the humanitarian effects, the humanitarian impact, sorry, to the best that they can. And they've helped to resettle um, people from Myanmar, whether we're talking from, the Thai-Myanmar border, some Rohingya from Bangladesh, for example. So, trying to address the problem around the edges and alleviate some of the suffering, but really leaving it to ASEAN to deal with. There is a lot made of sort of the US-China rivalry, but I think certainly under the Biden administration, there was not really any desire in Washington to make Myanmar a sort of geopolitical battleground. Um, and there was, to some extent, a degree of consensus, but a sort of understanding, I guess, between Beijing and Washington, I think, on Myanmar, that neither side would drag the other into the conflict in Myanmar. Um, but I mean, the reality is this is China's backyard. And when it got to the point that the military seemed like it was teetering, and this is in middle of last year, that it felt it had no choice but to intervene, in a way that it had not done previously. Um, just because, it has economic interests. The China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. There's already billions of dollars invested, so it's about protecting assets. It's also about stabilizing the border, preventing the conflict from spilling over the border. And I think to some extent, a degree of wariness about the NUG and the perception that the NUG is Western backed, and that if the military collapsed, would the NUG, try to assert control, take power in the center. And China would have seen that as a threat, I think. And so to some extent, it was about preventing that outcome from happening. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that the US really has grand ambitions in Myanmar. You and your readers or listeners, sorry, may be aware of sort of recent reporting um, around the US and Bangladesh and Arakan Army. I mean, there's no basis to any of this, as far as I can tell. It's all quite fanciful and being cooked up. Well, I mean, we can only speculate where it's come from, but I think there's no real basis to it. The US doesn't have these ambitions in Myanmar.
And this is actually very important for Bangladeshi audience, that I mean, if we were to look at the map, and if we were to speculate that suppose US did have sort of sort of some kind of anti-China design to get into into Myanmar, would Bangladesh even be the most natural conduit when there's a much longer land border with between Myanmar and Thailand, for example, right?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean that's a valid question. Whether it would be the most logical entry point. Um, Another factor I think is that, I mean, just to kind of point out why this might not be a very there might not be any basis to this. I mean, the Arakan Army, started like as an armed group, started on the border with China, in 2009. And its alliances are all with armed groups that are in that region on the China border. It's quite close with the Wa, for example, the Kokang armed group, the Kachin, and so on. Um, and so its orientation is more towards Beijing, um, if anything. And I mean, I think that for the Arakan Army, it's not really in a position to cross any red lines with Beijing. That's not to say that China controls the Arakan Army or necessarily even has the capacity to control it and to direct it what to do. But I just think that it's a mutually beneficial relationship in some ways, and for the Arakan Army, it's not going to put that relationship at risk to try and support any sort of US ambitions in Myanmar. That would just be an incredible risk, and I think not one that the group would be willing to take. And I mean, I think within the Arakan Army, there's also a fair amount of skepticism towards the West, in part because of the Rohingya issue and the perception that the West has sided with the Rohingya and kind of demonized the Rakhine people to some extent, and certainly not acknowledged the suffering of Rakhine people. That's a common grievance that you hear. So. Yeah, I mean, I just don't think that in the Arakan Army, the US would find an ally really. It just doesn't make sense. Plus, I mean, the kind of narrative was of this alliance between Arakan Army, Chin National Front, and ARSA, and these are three groups that just don't get along. So that didn't make any sense either.
Okay, then now that sort of brings us sort of to Rakhine and Chin, sort of that area. Okay, so we've got Arakan Army, we've got the Chin, and we've got Harsa. We've got Rakhine ethnic people, and we've got the Rohingyas. Rohingyas,
Yeah.
obviously, in Bangladesh, as we understand. So these are these sort of Muslim minorities that have been driven out over the last 10, 12, 15 years, or historically. both the Burman government or Myanmar, sort of the Burman people and Myanmar government don't recognize them as Myanmar citizens. So I think this is well understood in Bangladesh. Tell us about these various um, ethnic insurgencies, Arakan Army, ARSA, and Teen National Front. What do they want? Why don't they get along? What are their specific things? And also, you mentioned previously that Arakan Army would like to see a confederate model, or sort of their aspiration is to have a Rakhine state that is quasi independent from central authority. They of course have access to the sea, right? And Akyab or Sittwe is, sort of a fairly decent sized port, or can be built into a much better port, right? So they are, sort of much more capable. They are, geographically in a much more
Yeah.
favorable location compared with many other groups, right? So yeah, there you go. So tell us about what's happening in Rakhine. Who are the different people, different groups? What do they want? Who are their backers? And yeah.
Yeah, so historically, Rakhine has been dominated by two ethnic groups. So the Rakhine, which is where the state's name comes from, and the Rohingya. And the Rohingya have, lived in Rakhine for generations. There's a lot it's very contested between Rakhine and Rohingya because, um, these narratives are important, right, for establishing legitimacy, and ethnic, how do you say? So the whole the nub of the issue to some extent is this idea of indigeneity. And this matters in Myanmar because and we're getting into the weeds a little bit, but the
Sure.
1982 citizenship
Absolutely.
law that the
Yeah.
military introduced created this idea that only indigenous ethnic groups automatically qualified for citizenship. So if you're not from an indigenous group, like the Rohingya, not considered indigenous to Myanmar, then you don't automatically qualify. You have to go through this incredibly bureaucratic process to get citizenship. And even if you are eligible, like the overwhelming majority of Rohingya would be eligible for citizenship because they can trace, their family back a sufficient amount of time to qualify. But this bureaucratic process can easily be stalled to effectively deny you citizenship. And in practice, what happened was only wealthier Rohingya could get citizenship by paying bribes. And I'm not saying that those who were paying bribes were ineligible and were able to get it because they're paying bribes. Basically, they're paying bribes to get the state to do what it should be doing, right? And so you had the vast majority stateless, and so incredibly vulnerable. Um, but also you had the Rakhine community. I mean, Rakhine was by some measures, the poorest state in Myanmar, in the 2010s. And so the Rakhine had a lot of their own grievances of neglect from the central state, political marginalization, as I mentioned, the Rakhine people had voted fairly overwhelmingly for Rakhine political parties, but got very little power. And so these senses of grievance fueled the Arakan Army insurgency through the 2010s. At the same time, you had, after 2012 communal violence, you had a lot of restrictions on Rohingya that fueled the ARSA insurgency in northern Rakhine. So you had these parallel kind of insurgencies forming through the 2010s. And obviously ARSA came to the fore in 2016, 2017 with its attacks that prompted the military to carry out this counterinsurgency campaign that's being called a genocide. And the Rohingya, 750,000 Rohingya fled into Bangladesh. So this is going on, and at the same time, you've got the Rakhine insurgency launching in 2018, 2019 in a big way, and essentially continuing since then, for the past 7 years with a few pauses in between, tactical pauses from the Arakan Army. The Chin are further up there is a Chin community in Rakhine, but primarily in Chin State, and the difficult relationship between Arakan Army and the Chin National Front is essentially over who should control southern Chin State. Now, Chin National Front and some Chin people will say, well, this is Chin State, Arakan Army, you have no place here. You know, what are you Rakhines doing here? For the Arakan Army, southern Chin is strategically, I mean, absolutely vital because it's a pathway into Mizoram through the Caladan River corridor. And so the Arakan Army is never going to give up Palewa in particular. But they've also sponsored the creation or strengthened Chin insurgent groups that don't get on with the Chin National Front. So there are sort of two competing Chin alliances, and one is backed by the Arakan Army. And so, you know, at times Chin armed groups have been fighting against each other, you know, over the past year or so. So that's quite a challenging conflict. But, you know, I think the Arakan Army and its alliance sort of is quite powerful at this point. And so that, in a way, that should, you know, as long I think as they leave sort of central Chin for the CNF, Chinland Council, that should avert like a larger scale conflict. But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult neighborhood. I mean, and you talked before about, I mean, Shafiq mentioned Myanmar has all these conflicts, and it's from the outside, it seems very complicated. And a lot of it relates to the ethnic diversity of the country. I mean, officially 135 ethnic groups. You know, that list is quite discredited, but it gives you a sense of how diverse the country is. And many of these ethnic minorities, because their aspirations, political aspirations, have not been met, you know, or have been rejected by the Myanmar military, have resorted to insurgency. So you do have this really high number of armed groups in the country.
Yeah. And even within Rakhine, it seems that, it's not quite straightforward that, sort of there's the Arakan Army, and Arakan Army is backed by the XYZ, and sort of good guys versus bad guys. It's quite complicated in that there's the Rakhine insurgency of the Arakan Army because, they feel they had been neglected. And then there are the Rohingyas and the contested citizenship and displacement, statelessness and
Yeah.
genocide and ethnic cleansing. So there's that element, and there are various Chin factions and the corridor with India and so on, right? So it's a and
Yeah, there's a
in
lot
the
going on
main,
here because you've got
yeah,
also the Chinese pipeline, the
and
port
the
in
Chinese,
central Rakhine,
yeah,
right?
right, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And again, sort of bringing it back to what you had said, that the idea that the US is going to get involved here um, through Rakhine is quite fanciful because, sort of the broad Western view is that, okay, look, sort of Southeast Asia, ASEAN guys, you guys deal with this, and we'll back you with, or we'll give you financial support, humanitarian support as needed. But any political issues, sort of you deal with it. And ASEAN, most ASEAN countries are, of course, to southeast of Myanmar, not northwest. As in, sort of again, to
yeah,
stress the point for our listeners in Bangladesh, our audience in Bangladesh, that look, sort of the geography of this does not look like something needs to happen to Bangladesh. It makes much more sense for Southeast Asians, ASEAN, sort of so Thailand and Vietnam, and sort of to west of Myanmar, not east of Myanmar.
yeah, yeah. This has been the traditional sort of, I suppose, if we think about US sort of covert operations in Southeast Asia and Myanmar, it has traditionally been focused along that Thai Myanmar border. I mean, you have some groups there that I mean, they're Christian. They're more sort of predisposed towards the West, I suppose. Um, that's not to say that they've traditionally received like a huge amount of support, but that would be the more natural place if the US wanted to get involved in Myanmar for it to happen. Now, as I said, I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, we've got to like the US now is very isolationist. The idea that they would be interested in getting involved in Myanmar in a serious way, I think just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And even if they wanted to, there's just not the opportunity there, I think, for it to happen.
So then, bringing it even closer to Bangladesh. So, Arakan Army now controls most of Rakhine. Would that be reasonable to say? Or they are at the moment they are the strongest, uh, in the strongest position militarily amongst various players.
Yeah.
Would that be reasonable to say?
Yeah. I mean, 90% of the territory in Rakhine would be under Arakan Army control now. The military really just controls three pockets around Sitwe, around Chalpu, and these are very small kind of areas, to be honest. And also an island called Manong, um, which is not particularly significant. But you can imagine it would be quite a challenge for Arakan Army to invade an island that's well defended. So yeah,
And Situa is the big city, right?
Sittwe is
The
the
capital.
capital of Rakhine, and Chaopu is important because of the pipeline. There's electricity, power plants. The Chinese are building a port there. So it's important because of its infrastructure and sort of geo strategic significance. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can
So
I can
across the border from Bangladesh is Rakhine, is basically Arakan Army control, right?
Oh,
So
the entire border now is under Arakan Army control. Yeah, absolutely. The Arakan Army captured the last military base in Mongdo Township last December. So since then, the military has not had a presence in northern Rakhine State. Um, but some Rohingya armed groups are still there, um, contesting sort of Arakan Army control. We can talk a bit more about that later if you like. I can see that Shafiq has posted a few questions as well. So
yes.
there was just one that maybe ties into this. Where are the insurgents getting their arms and supplies from? Um, so primarily, this alliance that the Arakan Army is part of, it's a sort of informal alliance of northern armed groups. Um, they tend to get their weapons from the UWSA, which has uh, factories that produce weapons. And so you see them using sort of Type 81 imitations, which is a Chinese assault rifle, fairly uniformly. But smaller armed groups across Myanmar have different sources of weapons. For groups in central Myanmar, often it's to capture, to take them from the Myanmar military and the police. But there are also obviously like weapons markets like black markets and so on, and other channels as well.
And a related question that Shofik had also asked, right? So obviously from Bangladeshi perspective,
Yeah.
repatriation of Myanmar would probably be the single biggest issue or single biggest policy objective. Um,
Mm.
but to the extent that there is the ethnic tension within Rakhine, how do the Arakan Army feel about that? Given the contested
Yeah.
history and ethnic politics that comes with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. I think so. Shafiq's question, like, is the Arakan Army being in control? Does it increase or decrease the prospect for repatriation compared to if the central state was in control? Um, well, the repatriation wasn't going anywhere before, right? There had been two attempts at repatriation in 2018, 2019. Um, and Rohingya weren't willing to go back because they weren't getting any guarantees on citizenship and other demands around security and so on, return to former villages. Um, so, I mean, Arakan Army is not necessarily in a position to give guarantees on citizenship. I mean, it can issue documentation, I suppose, but is that going to be recognized anywhere else in the world? Probably not. So that's certainly a challenge. But primarily, it comes down to trust, I think. Like, Rohingya, even after the refugees that I've spoken to, even after 7, nearly 8 years, are desperate to get back to their homes in Rakhine State. So the desire is there, but can the trust be built to move this process forward? And at the moment, unfortunately, it's going in the other direction for various reasons, including insurgent activity, Rohingya insurgent activity in northern Rakhine. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be incredibly difficult, I think, at this point, to convince or to create that trust so that Rohingya in the camps feel like they're going back to a safe environment in which their rights will be respected. That's sort of a separate question as to what the Arakan Army's intention is. I mean, I think the Arakan Army's kind of pragmatic on this point. To them, the relationship with Bangladesh is more important than it is for Naypyidaw, right? I mean, for Naypyidaw, it's the relationship with China, with Thailand, with India is more important than the relationship with Bangladesh. And so making concessions on the Rohingya, uh, I mean, it just isn't as essential for state survival, right? But I think for the Arakan Army, it's going to be very hard for their quasi-state to function without some degree of cooperation with Bangladesh. And so recognizing that, I mean, I think there's a willingness to try to make progress on repatriation, and to certainly signal that they are not against repatriation. And I think they're pragmatic about it. But is pragmatism enough to build trust with the Rohingya community? I think that's going to be the challenge, really.
And I guess the flip side of that, or that puts into context the strategic dilemma that Bangladesh government, not just the interim
Yeah.
government, but any elected government that might follow it, faces.
Yeah.
Right. On the one hand, the de facto control of the Myanmar central government is gone
Yeah.
from the border. De facto, we have the Arakan Army controlling sort of the border and Rakhine. On the other hand, and I sort of, and because that's sort of any repatriation would have to have to be through working with Arakan Army, and Arakan Army led government or quasi state is probably more willing to cooperate on that front. So that's on the one hand, but on the other hand, these guys are not, contrary to what is understood in Bangladesh, these guys are not necessarily, they're not pro-Western. They're not propped up by the U.S. If anything, they have closer links with China, and therefore, sort of any Bangladeshi strategic direction on that front would have broader U.S.-China considerations. Should that be reasonable to, sort of to say that
Yeah, I mean,
dilemma?
I think for Bangladesh, that's part of the challenge. Yeah, managing, maybe it's just perceptions, but that taking a particular position is sort of pro Western or pro American or pro Chinese when it comes to the Arakan Army. And also, obviously, Bangladesh has to balance to some extent sort of Indian interests. I mean, it's been interesting that India has moved forward with engaging Arakan Army, particularly over the past, 9 months to a year, um, since Sheikh Hasina's government fell in particular, that has kind of spurred India on to some extent to engage more with ethnic armed groups and particularly the Arakan Army. And so, yeah, the geopolitics here is not irrelevant. But I think primarily Bangladesh the government needs to come up with a policy that is in Bangladesh's interest. So yes, taking into account, the implications for its relations with China, India, the US, but really focus on Bangladesh's interests first, as it deals with Arakan Army. And I mean, and Crisis Group we've been saying this for a long time. I mean, since 2022, that at least that Bangladesh needs to increase its engagement with the Arakan Army, and broaden the engagement because before it was really a security cooperation or security channel dialogue. And I think it's really important to have a much broader engagement and dialogue so that the two sides understand each other better, understand their positions, understand their interests. And that's really how the relationship, can develop further. Um, and for a lot of this to happen also quietly and not out in the open, I think would be beneficial, because it's very easy for things that get said in public to be misconstrued by either side. And certainly, I think, with some of the recent uh, things that are going on in Bangladesh, Arakan Army, I think would be looking at it going like, what's going on here? Like, how are we getting dragged into this? Um,
Yes.
and probably have not a lot of sort of patience for Bangladeshi politics, and how that's impacting them. So that I mean, I think it's just really important to broaden that relationship so the two sides understand each other better.
So in that context, of course, in Bangladesh, there's all sorts of rhetoric going around, humanitarian corridor
Yeah.
that the interim government actually talked about and then backtracked away from it. And of course, sort of Bangladesh. So we don't want to get into Bangladeshi domestic politics, but just tell us, sort of this idea of humanitarian corridor. I mean, what exactly is it, or what
Yeah.
might it actually mean, and how that relates to this engagement with the Arakan army?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, so when the Arakan Army launched its attacks that ended the last ceasefire. So we're talking November 2023, Operation 1027. One of the first thing the military did was the Myanmar military was to blockade the state. So Rakhine is separated from central Myanmar by a mountain range. There's only really three roads from Rakhine into central Myanmar over the mountains. And so it's very easy for the military to prevent supplies from getting in. They control the ocean. I mean, they have a navy. They can blockade these three roads, and also they control the airport. So, they prevented essential goods from coming in. So fuel, agricultural inputs, as well as food products, medicines, basically everything that you need, to function, have a functional economy. Um, and this created shortages right across Rakhine. To some extent, this has been alleviated by trade with Mizoram through Palewa. Excuse me. But there was an opportunity, I think, for Bangladesh to informally allow trade, certainly, with Rakhine State, but also potentially some humanitarian assistance. And that could have been a way to also build trust with the Arakan Army, right? To engage with the Arakan Army. Um, but the direction that the interim government went was to try to establish a formal corridor, humanitarian corridor, with the UN involved. Um, and for that to work, I mean, Naypyidaw would have to agree to it. Um, and that was never, in my view, likely to happen. Um, when we think about the fact that the Myanmar military is blockading Rakhine State to prevent goods from getting to prevent goods from central Myanmar getting into Rakhine, why would they allow a neighboring state to
Right.
officially send goods in over the border? It doesn't make any sense to me. Um, and so, the interim government pursued this approach that I think was never likely to work, and now it has become a domestic political issue in Bangladesh, and I think, they've been forced to back away from the idea. But I think what could have been potentially feasible was something that was, informal, quietly done a bit under the radar. Um, and what would the purpose have been? I mean, stabilize the border area, like from the Bangladesh perspective, stabilize the border area, ensure that communities in northern Rakhine have access to affordable food, medicines, essentials to survive. and not create a competition for resources. In this context, where you've got the Arakan Army dominant and Rohingya communities still in Rakhine, if you create a competition or a scarcity of resources, I think it's fairly inevitable that Rohingya will miss out, that they won't be prioritized, um, and that it could lead potentially to conflict, right, over who gets access to food and essentials. And so I think that's a scenario that it's in Bangladesh's interest to avoid, because the consequences are predictable. Rohingya will try to leave Rakhine and come into Bangladesh. And actually, that's what we've been seeing over the past year or so.
At that about 100,000 or more people have come in, apparently.
Yeah, Triple RC's office has said this was a little while ago, 118,000 counted.
Right.
Now, how many are not counted, right? That's my question. But yeah, I mean, certainly over 100,000.
So it's quite fascinating here in that on the one hand, the actual, sort of actual on the ground, under the radar engagement might be more fruitful. But on the other hand, sort of you want to do the transparent thing, you want to bring the UN in and all of those things, except that sort of that was never going to work, and it seems that it's not working. But in the process, we have probably made the under the radar engagement, the practical engagement that might have been possible, we probably have made that more difficult, which is, I mean, sort of this is tragic and ironic at the same time, right? So
Yeah, it's unfortunate that it's panned out in this way. As you say, it has made engagement more, not just on, whether it's some humanitarian assistance or informal trade, but just relations more broadly between
sure.
Bangladesh and Arakan Army have been strained by developments over the past few months, and particularly, I think, recent weeks. So that is really unfortunate. Yeah, I mean, like I said, like I don't think the Myanmar military was ever going to agree to this plan. What I didn't really anticipate was how it would become a domestic political issue, and how it would become a stick to sort of beat the interim government with. Um, and that's probably my sort of lack of understanding of Bangladeshi politics. Maybe that was obvious. I don't know, but it seems like the interim government also did not expect that to happen.
We're looking at the time. We have gone way beyond our and the hour that we usually sort of do these things. But this has been a fascinating discussion, um, and sort of the things in Bangladesh are very fluid and complicated as it is. But Myanmar seems many 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 more fold. Very last question before we pause, which is how do you see things playing out in Myanmar over the next year or so,
Oh no,
broadly as well as
I
in
was
Rakhine?
hoping you wouldn't ask for a prediction. Well, what I always say is like, I mean, we talked about the complexity, right?
Of
Um,
course.
there's so many different factors at play here. If we think about Myanmar, um, there's probably 30, 40 reasonably large armed groups opposing
Mm,
the central state. The military also there are armed groups as well that are on the military side. They're proxies for the military. And you've got, China, India, Thailand also with shifting policies, economic factors. I mean, we could be talking about conflict and, the armed conflict, the state of the armed conflict, and the economy starts imploding in Myanmar, and that brings down the Myanmar military. And, so there are many different factors that can influence how events unfold. It's just very difficult to make predictions. But I think if we think about probabilities, the probability of regime collapse peak was at its peak sort of middle of last year, and China
right.
moving in to shore up the regime, not to support it, not to support Min Aung Hlaing, the junta chief, or the military necessarily, but to protect China's own interests, um, has certainly reduced the prospects for, the regime collapse in Myanmar, and increased the likelihood of, this continued sort of fragmentation, of the Myanmar state. As I said, Um, that doesn't necessarily entail sort of warring mini states, slugging it out, and targeting, civilian populations and sort of ethnic conflict. That is a possibility that we need to be, cognizant of, but it's not necessarily the most likely outcome. This can continued informal cooperation against the Myanmar military is more likely, because collectively it's in the interest of the anti-military forces to keep the military weak. So, although they may not have political agreement amongst themselves over where Myanmar goes in the future, they do have a shared common interest in making sure that the Myanmar military does not manage to strengthen itself, because that leaves them all vulnerable. So
Right.
the most likely outcome for me is a weak central state, with pretty strong uh, sort of statelets or quasi-states around it, controlled by ethnic armed groups primarily, and a very weak, dysfunctional Myanmar economy, in the center of the country. That to me is the most likely outcome, and unfortunately for the people of Myanmar, I mean that is not a pretty picture for the most part. It's a lot of unrealized aspirations, sort of a bit of a limbo, to be honest, between what was there before, which was a sort of fairly strong state, I guess, a lot of state control anyway. Um, and, but not quite at the point where ethnic armed groups or ethnic political forces can develop, really viable functioning states. I think that's going to be the real challenge for the Arakan Army. How do they make this state work? We talked earlier about this being, a territory that has a seaboard. This is quite unique in Myanmar. All the other ethnic armed groups control upland areas, landlocked areas. But can they take advantage of that? It's very difficult. The Myanmar military still has a navy, not a very particularly strong one. Um, but nevertheless, that gives it an advantage on the waterways, and will make it difficult, for the Arakan Army to take advantage of its geographic location. And yeah, so I mean, I think it's going to be very challenging for Myanmar and for its neighboring states, right? For countries like Bangladesh, Thailand, and India, they'll be dealing with the fallout from Myanmar, for years to come, I think.
Mm. And for Bangladesh, it seems that the Arakan Army is going to be around on
Yeah.
our southern border, and some kind of engagement, some kind of trust building, um, effective trust building rather than sort of megaphone diplomacy, um, would
Yeah,
have to be
absolutely.
would have to be on the card for whatever elected government may follow later this year. So
Yeah, and I think if we can just keep going just for 1 or 2 more minutes,
sure.
um, we didn't talk about Rohingya armed groups, and I think
Right.
this is a big challenge for Bangladesh. It's a real thorn in the side, I suppose, for relations with the Arakan Army. Arakan Army does not accept the legitimacy of Rohingya armed groups, rightly or wrongly. I mean, that's the reality. And generally, that's the case in Myanmar. I mean, the ethnic armed group, or EAO kind of acronym, is applied to ethnic armed forces, but Rohingya armed groups are referred to as terrorists. It's a delegitimization strategy, and it's not just the Arakan Army. I mean, this is other ethnic political forces as well, and the Burmans generally refer to them as terrorists because they don't accept their legitimacy. So um, the reality is, Arakan Army does not accept Rohingya armed groups, sees them as a security threat. And, they are, particularly ARSA is active in the border area and has been carrying out attacks in recent months. And this has, led to counterinsurgency responses from the Arakan Army that have prompted more and more Rohingya to flee into Bangladesh. So it is directly harming Bangladesh's interests, increasing the scale of the refugee crisis, and putting any potential solution sort of further away, right? Moving away from any potential solution. So I think that's a critical issue that Bangladesh needs to grapple with, because you know, while Rohingya armed groups are there and active in the border area, it's going to be very difficult to have an effective positive relationship with the Arakan Army.
That's a very vexing
Yes.
problem. Very vexing. On a we're going to end on a very vexing. We usually like to end these things on a positive note, but I don't think we can spin it at all to end on a positive note.
It's a challenge.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you have any last questions before we say goodbye to Thomas?
No, so sorry, like I wasn't able to participate. My connection is like horrible, but like thank you very much. Like it has been very illuminating, especially the last parts where Bangladesh was directly concerned. They are like very much so much clear that we would like to make an immediate clip out of that part because that part stands out and more people should get that view because there's a lot of disinformation, confusion, and everything going around in Bangladesh about Myanmar, about humanitarian corridor and other thing. The way you explain the humanitarian corridor thing, that's very very good, and I think that should be, we'll try to circulate as much as possible.
Okay. Thanks, Thomas, for participating. This has been very illuminating. We will release it on YouTube and Spotify and so on. Once again, thanks for joining.
No worries. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks. Okay, now we're going to stop. Okay.